The Polygon Siskiyou T9 and the RE Cascade Peak Pro are the undisputed champs when it comes to providing high performance without a high price tag. Both bikes have their fair share of high-end components and in their own unique ways are a ton of fun to ride. And that's great, but it doesn't really help you all that much if you're trying to decide on which bike to buy. But that's what I'm here for. Today, I've got 5 different tests that I'm going to put both of these bikes through. We're talking about build quality, climbing efficiency, technical climbing, technical descending, and finally, flow trails or jumping. Our first test is build quality. We're going to go ahead and compare different frame features, geometry, and components that each bike comes with. And let's start with the frame. Despite looking pretty different, the frames on both of these bikes are actually pretty similar. Both have 140 millimeters of suspension up front and 135 millimeters in the rear, and in most cases, come spec'd with 29-inch wheels. I say most cases because the Siskiyou T9 is actually available in a 27.5-inch wheel size on the smaller sizes to better fit riders with a shorter inseam, and the Cascade Peak Pro has a flip chip that allows you to run a 27.5-inch rear wheel for pretty much the same reason. In terms of geometry, these two bikes are basically identical as well, with both bikes being within 5 to 10 millimeters or half a degree on all notable measurements. So at least on paper, both bikes have essentially the same skeleton. So let's move on now and talk about their components. In terms of suspension, the Polygon Siskiyou T9 gets a Fox 36 Performance Elite fork and a Fox Float Performance shock, whereas the RE comes spec'd with a DVO Diamond D1 fork and DVO Opal shock. Both options provide a wide range of adjustment, making them easy to hone into your specific needs. I'll talk a bit more later on about how each of these different suspension setups felt on the trail, but for the most part, they're both equally high quality, and if anything, I'd maybe give it to the Fox stuff that's on the Polygon, just because it's going to be easier to bring it into your local bike shop and have them have the spare parts that you need, as well as the knowledge to service that equipment, whereas DVO is a bit more niche. The T9 is equipped with a Shimano XT drivetrain and TRP DHR Evo brakes, while the Cascade Peak Pro gets a SRAM GX drivetrain and SRAM DB8 brakes. In my opinion, this is probably the biggest differentiator, at least in terms of components, between these two brakes. The TRP brakes on the Polygon not only list for quite a bit more than the DB8s found here, but they're also significantly more powerful. The Shimano XT drivetrain is slightly more comparable to the SRAM GX found on the RE, but I'd still say XT takes the cake. The XT shifts are so smooth, and if you've ever had the chance to ride with one of those XT shifters, then you know that once you get used to that double upshift, it's pretty hard to go back to anything else. Another equally important but often overlooked set of components that we need to talk about next are wheels and tires. The Polygon comes spec'd with a set of Entity rims laced to Shimano hubs, whereas the RE gets a pair of E13 Sylvan wheels. In this case, the win is definitely going to go to the lighter weight, higher engaging wheels found here on the RE, and they play a big deal in making this bike about a pound lighter than the Polygon. Last but not least, both bikes roll on a set of Maxxis tires, the Polygon coming with the ultra grippy Assegai, whereas the faster rolling Minion and Aggressor combo on the RE is a bit more common for bikes in this travel range. All in all, both bikes provide a ton of exceptional performance for the price. But we're not here today to hand out participation trophies. There has to be a winner for our first test or category, and that is going to be the Polygon Siskiyou T9. Yes, the heavier wheels and more aggressive tires do bump the weight up, but for me, the T9's higher end suspension, drivetrain, and brakes more than make up for it, making it the total package for those demanding high performance out of their bike. But speaking of performance, I think it's about time we move on and talk about how each of these bikes performs on the trail. And like I mentioned earlier, I tested this in 4 different areas. We got climbing efficiency, technical climbing, technical descending, and flow trails or jumping. Now, let's be honest for a second. I doubt that many of us got into mountain biking because of our love for riding our bikes up hills. But for most of us, pedaling ourselves from the bottom to the top is a necessary evil for all the fun we have screaming back down. And that's why having a bike that's not only comfortable to climb, but also relatively efficient is super important, regardless of what your preferred discipline is. The T9 and Cascade Peak Pro are both adequate climbers in their own right, but each come to the table with slightly different strengths and weaknesses. The T9 provides a much firmer pedaling platform than the Cascade Peak, allowing you to transfer a ton of power through the cranks. That said, its heavier wheels and large, slow-rolling tires aren't doing any favors when it comes to climbing smooth single-track or fire roads. The RE, on the other hand, has very active suspension, and you can visibly see the bike bobbing in its travel while pedaling. This can of course be remedied by taking that climbing switch and moving it into the pedal position or the lock position, but to be honest, on a mid-travel trail bike, I don't want to have to worry about that. Now, one thing the Cascade Peak does have going for it in this category is its very comfortable climbing position, which is largely due to its slightly steeper seat tube angle. It was honestly tough to pick a winner here, and I hate doing this for our very first on-trail category, but in this case, I am gonna have to call it a tie. If climbing efficiency is super important to you, like it is for me, then there's a couple things that you can do to make each of these bikes a bit better in this regard. First up, with the Polygon, simply switching out those Assegai tires for something that's a bit faster rolling and lighter weight will make worlds of difference. And of course, with the Ari, you can just go ahead and flip that pedal switch. Just make sure you remember to set it back to open again before you start coming back down. Now, don't get me wrong, I hate long, steep, boring climbs just as much as the next guy, but I actually do enjoy a good technical climb every once in a while. And that's exactly what our third category is. But this time around, we do have a clear winner. That same direct power transfer that I liked on the Polygon on the smoother, more efficiency style climbs also came in huge here on the technical part of the trail. But in this case, the uber grippy Assegai tires were also a benefit. The bike spun its way through chunky rocks and wet roots with ease, and I was cleaning challenging bits of trail first go on the T9. Sadly, however, the same can't be said about the Ari. Like I alluded to earlier, the Ari has a very progressive rear suspension setup. What that means is that it's very soft at the top, but then ramps up and firms up as you move through the travel to prevent bottoming out. And I was actually really looking forward to climbing this bike on the more technical sections of trail. I thought that soft end would provide tons of grip and allow you to essentially just monster truck through things. And that may or may not be true. I never really got to find out. And that's because this thing was plagued with pedal strikes, even when riding with as little as 10% sag. I also tried riding this same section of trail with the pedal switch engaged, which helped a little bit, but was still inferior to the Polygon. So yes, the clear winner here was the Polygon, but we're nowhere near done with these tests just yet. In fact, we're just now getting to the good stuff, descending. But before we talk about that, if you've been digging this video, then you can let us know by hitting that like button. Appreciate that a lot. Now, let's get back to the bikes. As with climbing, I've broken descending down into two different sections. You've got your tech or more natural trails, as well as your flow trails where you're gonna see more jumps and berms and rollers. Let's go ahead and start with the tech. Both of these bikes stayed impressively composed in the chunky stuff, easily matching the capability of longer travel rigs. The Polygon's stiff chassis and slightly shorter wheelbase excelled at finding sneaky lines through rock gardens and turning trailside obstacles into kickers. The Ari's approach was a bit different, and it was here that we finally got to see that progressive suspension shine. This thing is a total plow bike. Just point it where you want to go, and somehow those 135 millimeters of rear wheel travel turn into 170. Not only does this allow you to carry more speed, but also increases grip on wet rocks and greasy routes. A good way to think about it is that the T9 lets you feel what's going on underneath you and then maneuver the bike accordingly, whereas the Cascade Peak mutes all but the largest impacts, but is a bit less responsive to smaller inputs from the rider. These two very distinct ride characteristics are going to appeal to different types of riders. I personally did like the Polygon and how it rewarded rider input a bit more than the Ari, but I realized I'm probably in the minority here. Once again, it was tricky to choose a winner in this category, but in the end, I am going to give it to the Ari. That bike's ability to carry speed and instill confidence in technical terrain really was impressive. Our final category to compare these two bikes in is flow trails or jumping. And to be honest, for me, this is probably one of the things I care most about when shopping for a new mountain bike. Unsurprisingly, the T9 sporty rear suspension and short 430mm chainstays made it a pop machine. Whether it's pulling up for a double or pumping through a berm, the T9 definitely feels like it was made for fun, feature-filled flow trails. In addition, the short wheelbase made throwing whips and doing cutties a breeze. Really feels like the T9 is designed to make the trail feel more like a skate park. And that's a characteristic I love in mountain bikes. Now, if I'm honest, I was a bit skeptical as to how the Ari's soft suspension would fare on these flow trails, but the bike surprised me. It actually has a decent bit of mid-stroke support, so you really can push off that bike. So whether you're popping off a lip or pumping a roller, it did better than I thought, but it's still not nearly as poppy as the Polygon. I actually think that the Ari's biggest strength when it comes to these types of trails has less to do with getting off the ground and more with when you're coming back down again. The combination of the soft initial suspension stroke and plenty of bottom out resistance made it very forgiving, encouraging you to try features you might otherwise choose to ride around. Once again, both bikes had their own unique strengths on flow trails. And similar to the tech stuff we talked about earlier, I would say that the Polygon caters a bit more to riders who prefer something that's going to be more maneuverable and poppy, whereas the Ari is best for folks who are willing to trade a bit of playfulness for added forgiveness. But in the case of jumps and flow trails, I think a majority of us are more interested in getting creative and, more importantly, getting air than anything else. So in this case, I'm giving the win to the Siskiyou T9. So in the end, the Polygon Siskiyou T9 walked away with 4 victories, whereas the ARRI Cascade Peak Pro came away with 2. But like I said at the start of the video, both of these really are incredible bikes, especially considering their low price tag. But they both just have slightly different flavors. In general, I would say the Polygon is best for riders who really like to ride their bike, if you know what I mean, whereas the ARRI is maybe more suited for folks who'd rather sit back and let the bike do all the work. There were, however, 2 areas that the Polygon really did rise above the ARRI, and that was in its component value as well as in its performance on technical climbs. And it's for that reason that I would say that the T9 is the clear winner when comparing it to the Cascade Peak Pro. I've been fortunate enough to spend a lot of time on both of these awesome bikes behind me and would love to answer any additional questions that you have about them. So if you've got those, go ahead and leave them in the comments. While you're there, if you haven't done so already, I'd appreciate it if you go ahead and like this video, as well as subscribe to the Bikes Online channel. And after you've done that, get out there and get ripping.